The ceiling of the Grand Conclave chamber was glowing amber when I walked in, and that told me everything I needed to know before a single word was spoken. Amber meant hostility. Amber meant consensus had already been reached behind closed doors, and whatever was about to happen in this chamber was theater designed to give the appearance of deliberation. I had been sitting in this room for 11 years, watching that ceiling shift through every shade of mood the 43 species of the Galactic Accord could collectively produce, and I had learned to read it the way a sailor reads clouds. Green was calm, blue was contemplative, white was neutral, and amber was a storm warning, the kind that tells you the weather has already decided what it is going to do to you, and the only question left is how badly you want to be standing outside when it arrives. I took my seat in the lowest tier. They called it the courtesy chair, which was a diplomatic euphemism so polished you could see your reflection in it. What it actually meant was this: you are here because our bylaws require us to let you in, but we want you to understand, every single time you sit down, that you are beneath us. The chair sat below every other delegation platform in the semicircular amphitheater, tucked into the curved base like a footnote at the bottom of a very long and important document. From where I sat, I had to crane my neck to see the upper tiers, and every species in the chamber could look down at me without effort. The arrangement was not accidental. Nothing in this room was accidental. I had spent more than a decade in this chair, and the cushion had long since molded to the shape of my body. I crossed one leg over the other, set my hands on the armrests, and looked up at 43 species looking down at me. Some of them had the decency to pretend this was a normal session. Most of them did not. High Arbiter Quellardine of the Rashathi Collective was already standing when the session was called to order. That was unusual and deliberate. Arbiters were supposed to wait for formal introduction before taking the floor. The fact that Quellardine was already on his feet, already positioned at the central podium, already turning those flat black eyes toward the chamber, told me this session had been choreographed down to the minute. He was 7 feet of pale silver skin stretched over a frame that looked like someone had tried to build a human skeleton out of cathedral glass and gotten the proportions slightly wrong. His limbs were too long. His joints bent at angles that made my spine ache in sympathy. His eyes were solid black and lidless, and every time he blinked, it was with a secondary membrane that slid sideways across those dark surfaces, like a curtain being drawn across a window that had no glass. He was looking directly at me, and he had been looking at me since I entered the chamber. The Accord recognizes a formal grievance submitted by the Rashathi Collective, the Torvan Dominion, and the Selathi Parliament. The chamber's translation system announced in that flat, neutral tone it used for procedural matters. The grievance is directed at the provisional member species, designated Homo sapiens of Sol 3. I did not move. I did not shift in my seat or adjust my posture or allow any muscle in my face to register anything other than patient, attentive neutrality. I had been expecting this for 2 years. The only thing I had not known was the exact date, and now I did. Quellardine began speaking, and the translation system rendered his words into the chamber's common language with barely a heartbeat of delay. The charges were familiar to me because I had watched them being assembled, piece by piece, across dozens of classified intelligence briefings back on Earth. Unauthorized expansion into the Vanta Corridor, a region of deep space that the Accord had quarantined 9,000 years ago and declared forbidden to all member and provisional species. Construction of military infrastructure beyond the boundaries established by humanity's Provisional Membership Treaty, and the charge that carried the most weight, the one that had given the Rashathi the political ammunition they needed to build this coalition. Development of weapons systems operating on principles that the Accord's combined science councils could not identify, classify, or counter. I listened to each charge the way a doctor listens to a patient describe symptoms he has already diagnosed. About 40% of what Quellardine was saying was accurate. We had expanded into the Vanta Corridor, and we had built infrastructure there. Those were facts, and I was not going to deny facts. But 30% of his case was exaggeration, built on incomplete intelligence, assumptions stacked on top of assumptions, and the remaining 30% was someone else's intelligence failure repackaged as human aggression. The unidentified weapons, for instance. That charge was based on sensor readings taken by Rashathi surveillance probes that had swept the edge of the corridor and detected energy signatures they could not categorize. They had looked at something they did not understand, decided it must be a weapon, and brought that conclusion to this chamber as if it were established truth. I catalogued each accusation mentally, noting which delegations were leaning forward in their platforms and which were pulling back. The predator species, the ones who had evolved from hunting stock and still carried that territorial aggression in their posture and their politics, were leaning in. The Torvan, the American Shoal, the Seilathi, who were not predators by biology, but certainly were by economic temperament. The ones pulling back were the species who traded with Earth, the ones who had something to lose if this went sideways. I counted them. Not enough. Quellardine finished his presentation and called for a collective resolution. Not a discussion, not a period of deliberation, a vote. That confirmed what the amber ceiling had already told me. The politicking was done. The favors had been traded. The arms had been twisted. This chamber was not deliberating. It was performing. The delegations voted one at a time, each platform illuminating in red for support or blue for opposition. I watched the red lights climb with the steady patience of a man counting cards who already knows the deck is stacked. The Rishathi, red. The Torvan, red. The Seilathi, red. The American Shoal, red. The Drev Collective, red. Species after species after species, lighting up like a constellation of hostility, until 31 platforms glowed crimson and the chamber looked like the inside of an oven. 9 species abstained, their platforms remaining dark. 3 voted against, their blue lights barely visible in the ocean of red. The Cathali Trade Confederation, the Owelani Maritime Republic, the Dreth Industrial Combine. My quiet friends, my patient investments, 7 years of careful cultivation, discreet data sharing, and relationship building, all reflected in 3 faint blue lights against a wall of red. The ceiling shifted from amber to deep crimson, and the translation system delivered the verdict in that same flat tone it used for everything, from trade regulations to death sentences. The Galactic Accord has passed a declaration of hostile censure against the species-designated Homo sapiens of Sol 3. This declaration constitutes a formal state of war, effective immediately. The human envoy is recognized and invited to deliver a response. Every eye, sensor, optical cluster, and electromagnetic receptor in that chamber locked onto me. 43 species, hundreds of delegates, and every single one of them was watching the man in the courtesy chair, waiting to see what a human looks like when he learns his entire civilization has just been sentenced. I reached into the inside pocket of my coat. I felt the room tense like a living thing. Security officers on the upper tiers shifted their hands toward sidearms and pulse weapons. The Vrelian guards at the chamber doors adjusted their stances, weight forward, ready to move. I could feel the calculation rippling through the room. Was the human reaching for a weapon? A communication device? A detonator? I pulled out a cigarette. A real one, hand-rolled tobacco that I had brought from Earth 11 years ago and kept sealed in a vacuum case in my desk drawer. For exactly this occasion. The case had maintained perfect humidity and temperature for over a decade, waiting for the moment when I would need it. I placed the cigarette between my lips and felt the familiar weight of it, the papery texture against my skin. I reached into my other pocket and produced a match, not a lighter, a match. I wanted them to hear the sound. I wanted the sharp, percussive scratch of phosphorus igniting to cut through the silence of this chamber like a crack in glass. I struck it against the arm of the courtesy chair, and it worked exactly as I had planned. The sound was impossibly loud, a tiny explosion of chemistry and friction that echoed off the curved walls and made several delegates flinch. I lit the cigarette. I took a long, slow drag, pulling the smoke deep into my lungs, holding it there for a count of 3, and then releasing it in a steady, deliberate stream toward the ceiling. The bioluminescent surface flickered when the smoke reached it, confused by a chemical compound it had never encountered. For a brief moment, the deep crimson faltered, and patches of uncertain purple bloomed across the surface, where the smoke particles interfered with whatever biological mechanism generated the light. It looked like bruises forming on the sky. Quellardine stared at me from the podium, his black eyes absolutely still. The human envoy will deliver his formal response. I tapped the ash from the end of my cigarette onto the polished floor of the chamber. The sound of it hitting the surface was barely a whisper, but in the absolute silence of that room, it might as well have been a gunshot. "I heard you," I said. I did not stand. I did not raise my voice. I did not straighten my back, or square my shoulders, or adopt any of the postures that species across the galaxy use to signal defiance or readiness for conflict. I sat in the courtesy chair with my legs crossed, my cigarette burning between my fingers, and I looked up at 31 species who had just declared war on mine, with all the urgency of a man who had been told it might rain later. "Has the fleet been mobilized yet?" I asked. "Or are you planning to handle that after lunch?" The chamber erupted. The Torvon delegate slammed both fists on his platform railing, hard enough to crack the composite material, and barked something that the translation system rendered as a formal demand for my immediate detention and arrest. The Salethi delegates began chattering among themselves in rapid cascades of clicks and whistles that the translation matrix could barely process. Quellardine stood rigid at his podium, those black eyes fixed on me, and I could see the muscles in his jaw working beneath that silver skin, clenching and unclenching with a rhythm that spoke of very carefully controlled fury. But I was not watching the ones who were angry. Anger was predictable. Anger was noise. I was watching the ones who were quiet. 3 delegations on the upper tier had not moved, had not spoken, had not reacted at all. The Euratine, ancient and inscrutable, who had not spoken in open session of the Accord for over 200 years. They sat in their platform like statues carved from living stone, their angular faces unreadable, their bioluminescent skin dim and steady. The Pelori, whose compound eyes made it impossible to tell where they were looking, but whose absolute stillness told me they were focused entirely on me. And the Varathi, a species so old that their written records predated the founding of the Accord by thousands of years, watching me with the careful attention of scholars studying something they had read about, but never seen in person. They were not angry, they were studying me. They were trying to understand why the man who had just been told his entire species was at war did not look surprised. And that question, I knew from 11 years of intelligence work, was far more dangerous to the Accord's confidence than any fleet I could have threatened them with. I finished my cigarette slowly, savoring every drag while the chaos continued around me. The shouting, the demands, the procedural objections, all of it washed over me like background noise, like traffic sounds outside a window. When the cigarette was done, I pressed the burning end into the arm of the courtesy chair, grinding it slowly into the polished surface until it left a small, permanent black mark. A scar in the furniture, a tiny act of defiance burned into the seat they had given me to remind me of my place. I stood up, straightened my coat, and walked toward the chamber doors without waiting to be dismissed. Behind me, the chaos continued. Ahead of me, the corridor was quiet, and the 2 Vrelian security officers assigned to escort me were already falling into step. They had no idea what they had just started. More importantly, they had no idea it had started 6 years ago. The security escort was waiting for me outside the chamber doors, exactly as protocol dictated. 2 Vrelian soldiers, each one a full head taller than me, with exoskeletal plating that covered their torsos and upper arms like plates of natural armor grown from their own biology. Their faces were flat and broad, with deep-set eyes that peered out from behind ridges of bone so thick they looked like they were staring through fortress walls. They carried pulse rifles slung across their chests on tactical harnesses, and they positioned themselves on either side of me with the smooth, practiced efficiency of soldiers who had performed escort duty so many times it had become muscle memory. "Gentlemen," I said, falling into step between them as we moved into the diplomatic corridor. "Beautiful day on the station, isn't it?" Neither of them responded immediately. Vrelians were not known for casual conversation, which was a polite way of saying that their species considered small talk to be a waste of metabolic energy. But I had learned over 11 years that they were not as rigid as they appeared. They had opinions. They had preferences. They simply needed the right opening before they would share them. "Have either of you ever tried coffee?" I asked, as we walked past sealed bulkheads and emergency lighting. The one on my left, slightly taller, with a network of pale scars across the plating on his right forearm that suggested combat experience, glanced down at me. His jaw shifted sideways by a fraction of an inch, which was the Vrelian equivalent of raising both eyebrows. The human stimulant compound? That is the one. Bitter, dark, served hot, pairs well with existential dread. It is not compatible with Vrelian metabolism. The alkaloid compounds would cause neural overstimulation. That is a shame, I said. You are missing out. We walked through the diplomatic corridor of Apex Meridian, and I took in the atmosphere with a professional eye, cataloging every detail the way I had been trained to do. Emergency lights were cycling on the lower frequencies, painting the walls in alternating bands of yellow and white that gave the corridor a jittery, anxious quality. Sealed bulkheads had dropped across the intersections that led to the civilian sections of the station, thick slabs of alloy that ground into their floor tracks with a finality that said, "No one is going that way until further notice." Through the walls I could hear fleet communication traffic bleeding through in bursts of encrypted static, the muffled chatter of a military infrastructure that was spinning up for the first time in centuries. The station was shifting to a war footing, and it was doing it with the clumsy enthusiasm of an organization that had rehearsed the procedure many times, but never actually had to perform it. There is a difference between drilling and doing that no amount of preparation can bridge, and I could feel that gap in every rushed order, every overlapping communication channel, every bulkhead that sealed 2 seconds later than it should have. They took me to a holding suite on the diplomatic level, not a cell, not technically. The declaration gave me 72 standard hours to vacate accord space, and during that window, I retained my classification as a diplomatic representative with full courtesy protections under Article 7 of the Accord's Charter. The suite was small but functional, a narrow bed with sheets that smelled of nothing, a viewport that looked out over the station's central docking ring, and a dispenser unit that could produce water, nutrient paste, and a selection of bland beverages that tasted like someone had described the concept of flavor to a machine that had never actually experienced it. I sat down on the bed, loosened my tie, and pulled out a second cigarette. I had 3 left in the case. I needed to ration them. Then I opened a private channel. Not to Earth. Not yet. The timing was not right for that call. The encryption protocol I used was not standard Accord diplomatic encryption. It was a system my people had developed during the first 3 years of my posting, built on principles that exploited a fundamental flaw in the station's communication architecture. The Accord's security infrastructure was designed to prevent individual member species from intercepting each other's transmissions. It was layered, compartmentalized, and extraordinarily sophisticated. But it had been designed with a specific threat model in mind: lateral espionage between equals. It was not designed to detect or prevent surveillance by a species that sat at the bottom of the hierarchy, a species that everyone had decided was too primitive, too young, and too technologically limited to pose any kind of intelligence threat. We had mapped every signal relay, every routing node, every encryption handshake on this station over the course of 11 years, and we had done it from the courtesy chair. Invisibility has its advantages. The channel connected, and the face of Ambassador Sethri Val of the Cathali Trade Confederation appeared on my screen. Sethri was amphibian in body plan, with moist greenish-blue skin that glistened under the lighting of her quarters, wide horizontal pupils that expanded and contracted with her emotions, and a mouth that stretched nearly to the joints of what would have been ears on a human. She looked exhausted, the membranes around her eyes darker than usual, her skin slightly dry at the temples, which meant she had not been in her hydration chamber recently. "Nathan," she said, her voice carrying the faint gurgling undertone that Cathali speech always had, even through the translation matrix. "Tell me you have a plan." "I always have a plan, Sethri. How is the fleet positioning?" "Bad. Worse than bad. The Rishathi have taken operational command of the combined fleet. They are splitting into 3 battle groups. Group 1 is targeting your outer colonies in the Tarsus Belt. Group 2 is heading for the Meridian Chain. Group 3 is making for the Callaway settlements. Their tactical doctrine calls for simultaneous arrival at all 3 targets to prevent you from concentrating your defenses. They want to hit hard and fast before your people can fortify." I pulled on my cigarette and nodded slowly, letting the smoke trail from my nostrils. Everything she was telling me was consistent with what I already knew, but confirmation from a separate source was valuable. Timeline? 48 hours to weapons range on the nearest targets. Maybe less, if the Torvan push their drive systems past rated limits, which they probably will, because the Torvan have never met a rated limit they did not want to exceed. Nathan, the combined fleet is 11,000 warships. Even without the abstaining species contributing their forces, they have more than enough firepower to turn every human installation outside your home system into debris. I appreciate the update, Sethri. That is not an update. That is a death sentence, delivered in advance. You need to evacuate your people. You need to get everyone out of those colonies before the fleet arrives. I took another drag and let a small, controlled smile cross my face. We already have. She blinked, both sets of eyelids closing and opening in rapid sequence, which was the Cathali expression of genuine shock. What? The colonies are empty, have been for 3 weeks. Every civilian, every piece of mobile infrastructure, every system that could be disconnected and transported, all of it, gone. Sethri stared at me through the screen for a long moment, and I could practically see the recalculation happening behind those wide horizontal pupils. She was smart. That was why I had invested 7 years in building this relationship. Smart people are the ones worth cultivating, because they eventually ask the right questions without needing to be led there. You knew this was coming, she said. It was not a question. We have known for 2 years. I appreciate everything you have shared with me tonight, Sethri. You have been a good ally. I will be in touch. I closed the channel before she could respond. It was not polite, but every minute of the next 72 hours was a resource I could not afford to waste on reassurance. I sat in the quiet of the holding suite and smoked my cigarette down to the filter, watching the ember creep toward my fingers. The station hummed around me with the nervous energy of an organism preparing for something it had never truly experienced. I could feel it in the vibrations of the deck plates, in the slightly elevated pitch of the ventilation systems, in the way the lights seemed to pulse with an urgency that had nothing to do with the standard power cycle. Before I was a diplomat, I was military intelligence. Most people do not know that about me, and the ones who do tend to underestimate what it means. The Saul Defense Directorate recruited me out of university when I was 24. They ran me through threat assessment and strategic modeling for 6 years, teaching me to think in probabilities rather than certainties, to map networks of cause and effect, to remain functional under conditions where most people would freeze or panic. Then they sent me to Apex Meridian. Not because I was charming or eloquent or particularly good at dinner conversation, but because I could sit in a room full of hostile intelligence for a decade and remain steady enough to do my job. My job, for the first 5 years, was to smile, attend functions, submit to the daily indignity of the courtesy chair, observe everything, report everything, map the political landscape, the personal relationships, the factional rivalries, the trade dependencies, and the quiet resentments that simmered beneath the Accord's surface of civilized consensus. My job for the next 6 years was to turn all of that knowledge into leverage, slowly, patiently, the way water turns stone into sand. The expansion into the Vanta corridor was not reckless. It was bait, laid with precision and patience. We had identified the corridor as a strategic flashpoint within the first 2 years of my posting. The Accord had quarantined it 9,000 years ago, sealed it behind navigational interdictions and sensor blackouts, and declared it forbidden space. No ship went in, no probe came out, and no species, in 9 millennia, had bothered to ask the question that seemed obvious to every human who read the file: why? What was so dangerous that 43 species agreed to simply pretend an entire region of the galaxy did not exist? We asked that question, and then we went looking for the answer. What we found in the Vanta corridor changed everything. The unclassifiable weapons that the Accord's science councils had detected were not weapons at all. They were sensor echoes, reflections, and refractions of a technology so fundamentally different from anything the Accord had ever encountered that their instruments could not even begin to categorize what they were seeing. The Accord's analysts had looked at those readings through the only lens they had, and that lens was threat. They saw something they did not understand, and they assumed it was hostile. We saw something we did not understand, and we assumed it was an opportunity. We were right. I stubbed out my cigarette, pulled the blanket over my shoulders, and let myself rest. Not sleep. Rest. There is a difference when your mind is running probability calculations on the next 12 hours. But my body needed stillness, even if my thoughts did not. A chime at the door interrupted me 40 minutes later. I checked the security feed embedded in the suite's wall panel and felt a genuine surge of surprise push through my professional composure. High Arbiter Quellardine was standing outside my holding suite, alone, without escort, without advisors, without the retinue of aides that normally surrounded him like satellites around a particularly self-important planet. Arbiters did not visit courtesy-tier delegates. The social hierarchy of the Accord made such visits nearly unthinkable. The fact that he was here, now, told me something critical about the state of his confidence. I opened the door and stepped back to let him enter. Arbiter, this is unexpected. Can I offer you something? The dispenser does a passable water, if you can call it that. Quellardine entered the suite and stood in the center of the small room, his silver frame towering over me, his head nearly brushing the ceiling. He did not sit. I want to understand something, human. Nathan. My name is Nathan Cole. We have been in the same chamber for 11 years, Arbiter. You can use my name. His jaw tightened. I want to understand why you are not afraid. I sat back down on the bed and looked up at him without hurry. That is a fair question. Would you like the diplomatic answer, or the honest one? The honest one. You declared war on a species you have spent 11 years refusing to study. You put us in the lowest seat in your chamber, ignored every request we made for scientific exchange, denied us access to your historical archives, blocked our applications for expanded trade agreements, and treated us like a temporary curiosity that would eventually lose interest and go home. And in all that time, with all the resources and intelligence networks at the Accord's disposal, not one of your 43 member species bothered to ask one very basic question: what do humans do when they are ignored and underestimated? Quellardine's expression did not change, but I saw a micro-tension in the muscles around his eyes that told me my words had landed where I aimed them. We are not here to discuss your grievances. We are here because your species has violated foundational treaties of this Accord, and the consequences of those violations have been delivered. And your consequence is a combined fleet of 11,000 warships, backed by 2 megastructure-class weapons platforms, commanded by a joint military authority that has never coordinated a real combat operation. That is an impressive amount of hardware, Arbiter. Tell me something. How many wars has the Accord fought in the last 1,000 years? He did not answer immediately. I watched him weigh his options, watched him calculate whether honesty or evasion would serve him better in this moment. He chose honesty, and that choice told me more about how rattled he was than anything else he could have done. None. 0 wars in 1,000 years. That is remarkable. Truly. It speaks to the effectiveness of the Accord as a peacekeeping framework. Now, let me ask a different question. How many wars has Earth fought in the last 100 years alone? The silence that followed was the loudest sound in the room. I let it sit there between us, let it grow, let it fill every corner of that small suite, until Quellardine could feel the weight of it pressing against his silver skin like atmosphere. He turned and left without another word. The door sealed behind him, and I listened to his footsteps fade down the corridor, each one slightly faster than the last. He was not running, but he was no longer walking at an arbiter's pace. I opened a new channel. This one was different from the one I had used for Sethri. It did not go through Apex Meridian's communication infrastructure at all. It used a relay network that the Accord did not know existed, a chain of microsatellites that my people had seeded through the station's debris field over the last 8 years, each one no larger than a fist, each one invisible to the Accord's sensor sweeps, because they were designed to look exactly like the metallic junk that accumulated around any long-duration space station. The signal hopped from relay to relay, crossed into deep space, and connected to a single recipient on the other end. I had never met this person face to face. I did not know their real name, their rank, or their location. I knew them only by designation, and the designation was simple and descriptive. The conductor. My message was 4 words long. They took the bait. The response came back in 11 seconds. Good. Stand by. I poured myself a glass of water from the dispenser and held it up to the faint light from the viewport. The liquid was clear and still. I looked at my hand wrapped around the glass. Steady. Perfectly. Absolutely steady. Not a tremor. Not a ripple on the surface of the water. I drank slowly and thought about 43 species, 11,000 warships, and the single most important fact that none of them had considered. They had never fought something that fights back. The 72-hour clock started the moment the declaration was issued, and I spent the first 2 hours of it doing something that confused everyone on Apex Meridian who was paying attention to me, which, given the circumstances, was quite a lot of people. I filed paperwork. Specifically, I submitted formal requests through the Accord's diplomatic protocol system for individual bilateral audiences with each of the 9 species that had abstained from the vote. The requests were filed in triplicate, with proper jurisdictional citations referencing Article 9, Section 14 of the Accord's founding charter, through the correct administrative channels, time-stamped, sealed, and submitted with my full diplomatic credentials attached. The Accord was at war with humanity, but the Accord was also a bureaucracy, and bureaucracies run on rules the way engines run on fuel. Article 9, Section 14 was a procedural provision that had been written into the Charter 4,000 years ago by species who understood that political decisions made in haste could be catastrophic. It guaranteed any recognized delegate, even one representing a species under hostile censure, the right to request bilateral consultations with non-voting parties during the 72-hour withdrawal period. The provision existed specifically to prevent the kind of railroaded decision that had just taken place. It had never been invoked, because no species under censure had ever been bold enough, or foolish enough, to stay on the station long enough to use it. I was not leaving, and every hour I spent on Apex Meridian, filing procedural requests and conducting meetings, was an hour the Accord's fleet was burning fuel and morale, traveling toward colonies that no longer existed. My first meeting was with the Oelani. They were an aquatic species, evolved on a world that was 94% ocean, and their delegation suite on Apex Meridian was a carefully maintained environment of shallow pools, misted air, and humidity levels that would have had a human coughing within minutes. I had adapted years ago. Ambassador Peleth received me, standing in a basin of temperature-controlled water that reached his knees, his webbed feet submerged, his long translucent fingers trailing in the surface. He was tall and narrow, with skin that shifted between shades of blue and green, depending on his emotional state, and enormous dark eyes that occupied nearly a third of his face. "Envoy Cole," he said, his voice bubbling slightly through the moisture in his vocal chambers. "This is highly irregular." "Everything about this week is irregular, Ambassador. I will be brief, and I will not waste your time." I produced a sealed data chip and set it on the dry ledge beside his pool. This contains sensor logs from humanity's Deep Space Survey Network. The data covers a period of 4 standard years and documents sustained mining operations in the Aldhari Belt. Peleth's skin rippled, a wave of vivid blue racing from his temples across his skull and down his neck, surprise bordering on alarm. The Aldhari Belt is adjacent to sovereign Oelani territory. There are no authorized operations in that region. No, there are not. And yet these logs show 17 Rishathi extraction platforms operating on water-rich moons that fall within your species' recognized resource corridor. They have been running for approximately 4 years, pulling liquid water and mineral-rich ice in quantities that would qualify as industrial-scale harvesting. I did not elaborate. I did not editorialize. I set the data on the ledge, watched Peleth's skin cycle through 3 more shades of blue, and left the suite without another word. The data would do its own work. Facts always do, when you put them in front of someone who has a reason to care. My second meeting was with the Dreth Combine. The Dreth were an industrial civilization, their entire culture and economy built around manufacturing, fabrication, and large-scale resource processing. Their ambassador, Gorath Kell, was a massive creature with thick, rust-colored skin, hands the size of dinner plates, and a jaw that looked like it could chew through hull plating. His conference room smelled of metal shavings and lubricant, a scent that the Dreth apparently found comforting, the way humans find the smell of wood smoke or baking bread. I gave him a different file. This one was a comparative analysis of Accord tariff structures over the last 60 years, compiled from publicly available trade registry data. The analysis showed that import duties on Dreth-manufactured goods had been incrementally increased by fractions of a percent every fiscal cycle. Adjustments so small that no single change triggered a formal review or exceeded the threshold for automatic audit. But cumulatively, over 6 decades, those tiny increments added up to a 38% effective tax on Dreth exports that no other Accord species paid. Gorath Kell read the file in silence, his massive jaw working from side to side in the slow grinding motion that Dreth used when they were processing information that made them angry. He looked up at me with small, deep-set eyes that burned like coals in that broad face. "Where did you get this data?" "Every number in that file comes from the Accord's own trade registry. It is publicly available to any member species. Nobody ever compiled it into a longitudinal analysis, because nobody was looking for a pattern. We were. Why would humans look for this? Because 11 years in the courtesy chair gives a person a great deal of time to read, Ambassador, and humans are very, very good at reading." Over the next 28 hours, I met with 3 more abstaining delegations. Each one received a different file, tailored to their specific strategic concerns. The Varathi received intelligence about a Reshathi diplomatic initiative that was quietly building a coalition to reclassify several Varathi border systems as open development zones, which would have stripped the Varathi of territorial sovereignty over regions they had held for millennia. The Pelori received documentation of systematic underrepresentation in the Accord's scientific advisory councils, showing that Pelori research contributions were being credited to joint projects led by other species. Each file was different, each one was specific, and every single piece of data in every file was real, sourced from the Accord's own records, and from humanity's 11 years of intelligence gathering, from the most ignored seat in the room. The Accord had treated humanity's envoy as a minor inconvenience, a box to check on the attendance register. They had never considered that irrelevance is the best possible cover for an intelligence officer. For 11 years, I had been invisible, and invisible people have a way of seeing everything that visible people miss. Between meetings, I monitored the military situation through encrypted updates from the conductor. The picture was developing exactly as we had projected. The Accord's 3 battle groups reached their targets in sequence. Group 1 arrived at the Tarsus Belt first. Their advanced scouts, fast Reshathi corvettes with long-range sensor arrays, sweeping the target zone in standard approach formation. What they found made them stop and run their scans again. Nothing. Not ruins, not wreckage, not hastily abandoned structures with personal belongings scattered on the floors and half-eaten meals on the tables. Nothing. The colonies were gone. Every habitat module, every orbital platform, every atmospheric processor, every solar array, every water reclamation unit, every piece of infrastructure that humanity had built in the Tarsus Belt had been methodically disassembled, packed into transport containers, and moved out of the system. The ground where the surface settlements had stood was bare rock, scrubbed so clean that there were not even foundation marks left in the soil. It was as if humanity had never been there at all. The same reports came in from the Meridian chain and the Callaway settlements over the next 12 hours. Empty. All of them. 3 battle groups, thousands upon thousands of warships, burning across light years of space at tremendous cost in fuel and logistical strain, to attack targets that had simply ceased to exist. The evacuations had taken 3 weeks, and the coordinated effort of every logistical asset humanity possessed. Moving 800,000 people and their entire built environment across interstellar distances, without the Accord detecting it, was the largest covert operation in human history, and it worked, because the Accord had never watched us closely. Why would they? We were the species in the courtesy chair. We were beneath notice. On hour 44 of my 72-hour window, I received a communication that I had not expected. It arrived through a channel I did not recognize, using an encryption methodology that my systems could not identify, and it carried a single identifier tag, Narration. The Euratine had not spoken in open session of the Accord for over 200 years. They were one of the founding species, so ancient that the other members of the Accord treated them with a mixture of reverence and vague unease, the way you might treat a grandparent who has lived so long that they remember things everyone else has deliberately forgotten. I had spent 11 years attempting to establish contact with the Euratine delegation and received nothing but silence in return. Now they were reaching out. The message contained a frequency, a set of spatial coordinates within the station, and a single word that my translation matrix rendered as "come." I found them in a section of Apex Meridian I did not know existed. It was deep below the inhabited levels, buried in the station's original infrastructure, in a chamber that had been sealed since the day the station was constructed. The Euratine ambassador was waiting for me in complete darkness, the only illumination coming from the faint bioluminescence of the ambassador's own body, a soft blue-white glow that traced the outlines of a form that was thin, elongated, and folded in on itself like origami made from living tissue. Morath was old. Not old the way humans understand the word, not decades or even centuries, but epochs. The Euratine measured their lifespans in millennia, and Morath had been alive when the Galactic Accord was founded. The face I could barely see in that faint light was more geometry than biology, all sharp angles and flat planes that caught the glow and reflected it in unexpected patterns. "You are the human," Morath said. The voice was low and layered, as if multiple frequencies were speaking simultaneously, harmonics weaving through each other like threads in a tapestry. "I am. I do not want your data files. I do not want your intelligence assessments, or your strategic analyses. I want to know one thing, and I want the truth. Ask. What did your species find in the Vanta corridor?" I stood very still in the darkness, feeling the weight of the question settle over me. This was the question. Not a question. The question. The one that sat at the exact center of everything humanity had done, and everything we were about to do. And the fact that the Euratine were asking it, the founding species, the ones who had sealed the corridor 9,000 years ago, changed the calculation in ways I had not fully anticipated. I chose my words with more care than I had used for anything else in my career. The Vanta corridor was quarantined 9,000 years ago because the Accord's founders detected something there that terrified them. Your founders, Morath. Your generation. Your decision. You sealed it behind navigational interdictions and sensor blackouts, declared it forbidden, and spent 9 millennia making sure no one went in and nothing came out. Morath did not move, did not speak. The bioluminescence did not flicker. We went in. We found what you were afraid of, and you were right to be afraid, but you were wrong about what it was. It is not a weapon. It is not a hostile entity. It is not a threat in any conventional sense of the word. It is a network, a communication and transit infrastructure built by a civilization that predates the Accord by millions of years. It spans this galaxy and possibly extends into others. It is the single most sophisticated piece of engineering that any living species has ever encountered. I paused to let that settle. Morath's bioluminescence had dimmed noticeably, which I interpreted as the Euratine equivalent of going pale. We did not just find it, Morath, we woke it up. The silence that followed was so complete that I could hear my own pulse in my ears, each heartbeat counting out the seconds in the dark. "Is it active?" Morath asked, and for the first time I heard something in that layered voice that crossed every boundary of species and biology and translation. I heard fear. I lit another cigarette. The match flare in that dark chamber was like a tiny sunrise, and for one vivid moment, I could see Morath's face in full detail, every sharp angle and ancient line illuminated in warm orange light. "It has been active for 6 years. You could not see it because you stopped looking 9,000 years ago." Morath said nothing more. The meeting was over, decided by a silence that said more than words could. I found my way back to the inhabited levels of the station alone, navigating by memory and the faint emergency lighting in the maintenance corridors. My mind working through the implications of a founding species who had sealed away the most powerful technology in the galaxy, and then spent 9,000 years pretending they had not. When I reached my holding suite, a message was waiting from the conductor. It was longer than the last one. Coordinates across 9 points in Accord space. Timestamps precise to the microsecond. Deployment confirmations from assets I had never been briefed on, and a single sentence at the end that made every nerve in my body hum with the kind of controlled anticipation that comes only when years of preparation are about to produce results. Phase 2 is live. I sat down, finished my cigarette, and watched the stars through the viewport, while somewhere out there, beyond the range of anything the Accord could see. The largest strategic operation in galactic history was unfurling itself. The reports started coming in 6 hours after Phase 2 went active, and they came fast. The first gate opened in the deep void between the Rashathi home system and the Torvan border, a region of space so empty and so far from anything strategically relevant that no sensor platform had been deployed there in over 1,000 years. One moment the void was empty, the next moment it was not. A structure appeared, though the word structure is hopelessly inadequate for what actually materialized. It was a ring, a torus of material that defied spectral analysis, with an interior diameter large enough to pass a capital-class dreadnought through with clearance to spare. It appeared without precursor emissions, without gravitational distortion warnings, without any of the signatures that the Accord's detection networks were designed to identify. It was simply there, fully formed, as if it had always existed, and the universe had only just now decided to let people see it. The second gate opened 40 seconds later, 19 light-years away. Then the third, then the fourth. 9 gates in total, spaced across 9 points in Accord territory, each one positioned with surgical precision in the dead zones between major star systems, where no fleet was stationed, no surveillance platform was watching, and no species had any reason to look. I was in my holding suite when Apex Meridian's alert systems went critical. The calm yellow emergency lighting snapped to deep red. The deck plates began vibrating with the subsonic thrum of the station's defense grid powering up, a sound I had never heard before because the defense grid had never been activated in the station's operational history. Through the walls I could hear running footsteps, shouted orders overlapping in half a dozen languages, the sharp electronic tone of blast doors sealing across the station's central hub, and beneath it all, the rising whine of sensor arrays being pushed to maximum gain as the Accord's military infrastructure tried desperately to make sense of what had just appeared in 9 places simultaneously. I did not move from my chair. I poured myself a glass of water and watched the chaos through the viewport with the patience of someone who has been expecting the show and is finally seeing it performed. The Accord's sensor networks were overloading. 9 simultaneous gravitational anomalies of unprecedented magnitude, each one appearing without warning in locations that should have been empty, each one radiating energy signatures that did not match any known weapons system, ship design, stellar phenomenon, or natural event in the Accord's databases. The automated threat classification protocols were cycling through their entire library of known contacts and finding no match. The gates did not fit any category. The system could not decide what they were, and so it tried to classify them as everything simultaneously, flooding every military communication channel with contradictory alerts that turned the already fractured command structure into a cacophony of confusion. I tracked the response through the Accord's own communications, reading their encrypted traffic the way I had been doing for a decade. The 3 battle groups, still holding position in the empty spaces where humanity's colonies used to be, received emergency recall orders. But the orders came from 3 different command authorities at nearly the same moment, each issuing contradictory instructions. The Rashathi fleet commander ordered his battle group to hold position and maintain readiness. The Torvan tactical coordinator ordered all available ships to converge on the nearest gate for close-range analysis and potential engagement. The Accord's Central Military Council, a deliberative body that had not convened for actual combat decisions in living memory, issued a general alert and then spent 45 minutes in heated argument about command jurisdiction before producing a single actionable instruction. This was the weakness I had spent 11 years mapping, laid bare in real time. The Accord was not an alliance, it was a committee. Its military was not a unified force under a single command. It was 43 separate fleets, held together by agreements, protocols, and shared assumptions that had never been tested under genuine pressure. The moment real, immediate, unexpected pressure arrived, the seams tore open, and the whole structure began to pull apart. The gate stayed open for exactly 4 minutes. I knew this because the conductor had designed it that way, and the conductor did not deal in approximations. 240 seconds, 4 minutes of the Accord staring into 9 open doors that led to places they could not see, could not scan, and could not reach. Nothing came through. That was the entire point. No armada poured through the gates, No weapons fired. No invasion fleet materialized in accord space. The gates opened, held their shape against the fabric of space-time, like holes punched through a curtain, and then closed, completely, silently, leaving behind nothing but fading gravitational echoes and the lingering knowledge that they had been there. The message was not "we will attack." The message was "we could." From 9 directions simultaneously, at any point in your territory, without warning, without detection, without any possibility of prevention. The ability to be anywhere is more terrifying than actually being somewhere. A fleet can be tracked, engaged, and destroyed. A door that can open anywhere cannot be defended against, because defense requires knowing where the attack will come from, and when the answer is everywhere, defense becomes meaningless. I waited 2 hours for the acute panic to subside enough, for rational thought to reassert itself in the station's command structure, and then the chime at my door sounded. I already knew who it was. Quellardine entered my holding suite for the second time, and the transformation in him was visible in every detail. His silver skin, normally smooth and faintly luminous, had taken on a dull, flat quality that I recognized from Reshathi physiological profiles as an acute stress response, the equivalent of a human going pale and clammy. His movements were controlled, but lacked the fluid confidence that normally characterized Reshathi body language. His black eyes, when they found mine, held something that had not been there during our first meeting, or our second. Uncertainty. "What are those structures?" he said, and his voice was quieter than I had ever heard it. I gestured to the chair opposite me. He did not sit. I answered anyway. "They are transit gates, components of a network built by a civilization that existed in this galaxy millions of years before the Accord was conceived. The network threads through the Vanta corridor and extends into regions of space that your most detailed charts do not even have names for. We discovered it. We studied it. We learned to interface with its control systems, and we activated it. You built them." "No. We knocked, and they answered. The technology is not ours. The engineering principles behind it are so far beyond our current science that we can barely describe them, let alone replicate them. But we are the ones who figured out how to communicate with it. We are the ones who asked it to wake up. This is a violation of every treaty, every protocol, every foundational principle this accord was built on. You declared war on us, Arbiter. Treaties and protocols became somewhat academic at that point, wouldn't you say?" His fists clenched at his sides. His jaw worked beneath that dull silver skin. For a moment, I thought he might try to hit me, and I found myself calculating distances and angles out of old habit, the muscle memory of training that I had not used in years but had never quite forgotten. "What do you want?" he asked, and his voice had changed. It was quieter, more careful. It was the voice of someone who has just realized that the creature they cornered is not the prey they assumed it was. I stubbed out my cigarette. Then I did something I had not done once in 11 years in that chamber, in that holding suite, or in any room on this station. I stood up from the courtesy chair. "We want the same thing we have wanted for 11 years, Arbiter. A real seat at the table. Not the courtesy chair. Not provisional status. Not the grudging, condescending tolerance of species who consider us children, playing in a galaxy we do not yet understand. A seat. Equal standing, full membership with all the rights, privileges, and responsibilities that come with it." Quellardine stared at me, and the expression on his face, filtered through alien biology and cultural context, was something I recognized despite all of those barriers. It was disbelief. Raw, undisguised disbelief. "You did all of this. The corridor, the network, the evacuations, the gates. All of this for a seat? You declared war on us over a chair, Arbiter. Do not act surprised that we took it seriously." He left without a word. The door sealed behind him. I sat back down in the courtesy chair. Deliberately. Because symbolism matters. And the symbol that mattered most right now was a man who did not need to prove anything by standing, who could occupy the lowest seat in any room and still own the conversation. I opened a channel to the conductor. "He is ready to deal. Give me 12 hours. The response came back clean and immediate. "You have 14. Do not waste them." I closed the channel and looked out at the stars. Somewhere out there, 11,000 warships were drifting in empty space, their crews waiting for orders from a command structure that was tearing itself apart. 9 transit gates had opened and closed like the blinking of an enormous eye, and the fundamental assumption that had held the Accord together for 9,000 years, the belief that space was knowable, mappable, defensible, had been proven catastrophically wrong. 43 species spent 9 millennia building walls around a door they were afraid to open. We spent 6 years learning how to knock. That is the difference. That has always been the difference. The emergency session convened 14 hours later, and they held it in a room I had never seen before. Not the grand conclave chamber, with its amphitheater tiers and its mood-reading ceiling. This was a sealed conference room on the secure level of Apex Meridian, a space designed for the kind of negotiations that happen when the stakes are too high for theater. The walls absorbed sound so completely that every word spoken felt like it was being delivered directly into the bones of your skull. There was no bioluminescent ceiling here, no tiered seating, just a single circular table, 12 chairs of equal height, and walls that gave nothing away. 12 delegations were present. The 5 most powerful Accord members sat on one arc of the table. The Rashathi, the Torvan, the Selathi, the American Shoal, and the Pelori Union. Opposite them sat the 3 species who had voted against the declaration, the Kethali, the Owelani, and the Dreth Combine, and filling the remaining seats were 4 of the abstaining species who had, in the hours since the gate demonstration, quietly withdrawn their warships from the combined fleet and returned them to home space. The fleet had dropped from 11,000 ships to roughly 8,000, still an enormous force on paper, but paper does not fight wars. Cohesion fights wars, and the Accord's cohesion was dissolving like salt in water. I was invited to this session, not escorted, not summoned, not dragged before a tribunal. A formal invitation was delivered to my holding suite by a Rashathi diplomatic courier who addressed me by name and title and waited for my response with the kind of careful courtesy that people extend when they are no longer certain who holds the upper hand. And when I entered the conference room, there was a chair waiting for me at the table. Not below the table, not behind it, at it. I sat down, placed my hands flat on the surface in front of me, and said nothing. I let the silence do its work. Quellardine opened the session. He was more composed than he had been in my holding suite, the arbiter's mask firmly back in place, but the strain beneath it was visible to anyone who knew where to look. He laid out the Accord's position in measured terms. Humanity had activated a precursor network of unknown and potentially unlimited capability. Humanity had demonstrated the ability to project force, or at least the compelling illusion of force, into any point in Accord space without warning. The Accord required binding assurances that this capability would not be turned against its member species. I listened without interruption. Then the Rashathi military liaison, a general named Talis Own with the bearing of a career officer who had spent his entire life preparing for a war he had never expected to actually fight, stood and presented the alternative position. Send the remaining fleet into the Vanta corridor. Find the network's infrastructure, destroy it, collapse the gates, eliminate the threat at its source, and restore the strategic balance that the Accord had maintained for 9,000 years. I let Talis Own present his full case before I responded. When he was done, I leaned forward slightly and spoke with enough clarity that every translation matrix in the room could render my words without uncertainty. General Own, I understand the instinct. You see something that threatens the established order, and your training tells you to neutralize it at the source. But the network does not have a source in the way your strategic doctrine understands. It is not a facility you can bomb. It is not a command center you can capture. It is not a power grid with a switch you can turn off. It is a topology. It exists woven into the dimensional substrate of space itself, threaded through the fabric of this region of the galaxy, like veins through living tissue. Destroying it would require collapsing that dimensional framework across the entire Vanta corridor and every system that borders it. The energy required would be beyond anything the Accord has ever generated, and the collateral destruction would consume at least 4 Accord member systems that sit along the corridor's boundary. I paused to let the implications settle into the room like sediment in water. You cannot bomb a road out of existence without destroying every city built along it, General. And some of those cities are yours. Talasone sat down. The silence in the room rearranged itself, shifting from the tense quiet of confrontation to the heavier silence of recalculation. Sethri Val spoke next, and I felt 7 years of careful cultivation paying dividends. She proposed a formal motion, reclassification of humanity from provisional membership to full accord partnership, with veto authority over collective military actions affecting the Vanta network. Her argument was precise, well-sourced, and structurally impossible to dismiss without admitting that the Accord's current governance model was inadequate for the situation. Humanity possessed strategic capabilities that no other species could replicate, contain, or counter. Continuing to exclude humanity from full participation while simultaneously being unable to neutralize or match those capabilities was not a sustainable position. The only rational path forward was integration. The Rashathi erupted. Quellardine argued that granting veto authority to a species that had been under hostile censure less than 3 days ago would shatter the governance structure that held the Accord together. Talasone accused the Cathali of being compromised by human intelligence operations, which was partially true, but also irrelevant to the logic of Sethri's proposal. The Torvan delegate, a barrel-chested creature named Korath, whose voice sounded like gravel being ground between stones, slammed a fist on the table hard enough to crack the composite surface, and declared that the Torvan would submit to human authority when the stars went cold, and not 1 moment before. The room descended into argument, the kind of multi-species circular debate that the Accord had elevated to an art form over millennia of practice. I let it run for 20 minutes, watching the currents, mapping who was talking to whom, who was making eye contact, who was deliberately avoiding it. Then the session chair called a recess, and the delegates scattered to their respective corners of the room to confer with their advisors. I stayed at the table. I poured water from the carafe at the center and drank it slowly, watching the room the way I had watched every room on this station for 11 years. Morath appeared at my side without a sound. The Eurytine moved through space with an eerie silence that I had never gotten used to, and I did not register the ambassador's presence until a thin, angular hand came to rest on the table edge next to mine. "Walk with me," Morath said. We stepped into the corridor outside the conference room, and Morath led me to a viewport that looked out over the exterior of the station. We stood side by side for a long moment, 2 beings from opposite ends of the galaxy's timeline, looking at the same ancient stars. "I must tell you something that has been kept by the Eurytine alone for 9,000 years, Morath said. "Something the Accord does not know. Something that will change the way you think about what you have found." I waited. We did not quarantine the Vanta corridor because the network was dangerous. We quarantined it because the last species that activated it became so powerful that no force in this galaxy could check them. Morath's bioluminescence pulsed slowly, patterns of light chasing across those angular features, like thoughts made visible. They were called the Serenthi. They were brilliant, creative, relentlessly ambitious. They remind me very much of your species, Nathan Cole. They discovered the network, learned to interface with it, and within 3 generations, they had reshaped the political landscape of this galaxy entirely in their own image. No coalition could oppose them. No alliance could contain them. They had access to everywhere, and that access made them effectively untouchable. I listened without interrupting, without even breathing louder than I had to. The Eurytine were afraid, not of the Serenthi as a military threat, but of what unlimited access does to a species' character. We had seen it before in smaller forms, in our own history. Power without meaningful constraint does not make a species wise. It makes them blind, blind to the consequences of their choices, blind to the suffering they cause, blind to the slow erosion of the principles that made them admirable in the first place. The bioluminescence dimmed. Morath's voice dropped, and the layered harmonics that normally gave it depth and resonance flattened into something simpler, something very old and very tired and very sad. "What happened to the Serenthi?" I asked. "They left, through the network. They opened gates to places beyond the borders of this galaxy, places that no other species has ever seen or reached, and they went through. All of them. Their entire civilization, every individual, every ship, every record. Their homeworld is still out there, Nathan Cole. You could visit it. It is empty, intact, preserved like a monument that no one tends. They did not die. They did not collapse or destroy themselves. They simply decided that this galaxy was too small for what they had become, and they walked through a door that none of us could follow them through. And they never came back. They never came back. 9,000 years of silence, and we have never known why. Was it because they found something better on the other side? Was it because the network carried them somewhere they could not return from? Or was it something worse? Was it because once a species has access to infinite possibility, infinite doors, infinite horizons, they lose the ability to value any single one of them? They lose the capacity for connection, for commitment, for the kind of stubborn attachment to a particular place and a particular people that keeps a civilization grounded. Morath turned to face me directly, and in that ancient, angular face, I saw an expression that transcended every difference between our species. It was the look of someone who has carried a secret for too long and is desperate to make the next person who holds it understand why it matters. I tell you this because I see the same trajectory beginning in your species. You are brilliant. You are creative. You are ambitious in ways that this galaxy has not seen since the Serenthi themselves walked these stars. You found the network, and you used it. But hear me, Nathan Cole, and hear me clearly. The Serenthi were all of those things, and the network consumed them. Not through violence, not through malfunction, not through any dramatic catastrophe, through possibility. Through the sheer gravitational weight of infinite doors that can never all be opened, infinite paths that can never all be walked. They did not lose a war. They lost themselves. I stood in that corridor, with the stars burning silent and indifferent through the viewport, and for the first time since the declaration was issued, for the first time in 11 years of sitting in the courtesy chair, playing the long game, building my intelligence network piece by piece, and preparing for this exact strategic moment, I felt the ground shift beneath me. The conductor had not accounted for this. Our models, our projections, our strategic simulations, none of them had included the variable that Morath had just introduced, the possibility that the Vanta network was not simply a tool to be wielded, but a test to be passed. A test that another species, one that sounded uncomfortably like humanity in every description, had failed, not by losing, by winning too completely. I went back into the conference room with a revised position forming in my mind. The recess was ending, delegates returning to their seats, and I could feel the collective attention of the room settling on me with a weight that was almost physical. Everyone was waiting for humanity's next move. I stood at my place at the table and spoke. Members of the Accord, I am withdrawing humanity's request for veto authority. The room went so quiet I could hear the ventilation system cycling air through the ceiling ducts. 6 years ago, humanity discovered the most powerful infrastructure in this galaxy. We activated it. We learned to interface with it. We demonstrated, in terms that I believe were sufficiently clear, that we can project transit gates to any point in Accord space without warning or prevention. We could have used that capability in secret. We could have leveraged it for territorial expansion, for economic dominance, for the kind of unchecked strategic supremacy that empires are built on, the kind that makes a species powerful enough to do anything it wants, and eventually blind enough to stop asking whether it should. I looked around the table. Queller Dine, rigid and watchful. Sethri Val, her pupils wide with surprise. Gorath Kell, his massive hands flat on the table. Korath, leaning back with his arms folded. Morath, utterly still. We brought it to this table instead. Not because we are generous, and not because we are naive. Because we have studied our own history closely enough to know what happens to a species that relies only on its own power and answers only to itself. We have seen that story play out dozens of times on our own world, and it never ends well. I paused and let the weight of the next words settle into my chest before I released them. We are not offering the Vanta network as a weapon. We are offering it as a shared resource, under shared stewardship, with no single species, including humanity, holding unilateral control over its activation or deployment. I outlined the proposal in specific terms. A joint commission with rotating authority, no permanent chair, no species holding the gavel for more than one standard cycle. Equal representation from any Accord member that chose to participate. Transparent governance protocols for the Gate network. Joint research programs into the precursor technology. A binding, enforceable agreement that no species could unilaterally activate or deploy transit gates without commission authorization. We want a seat at this table, I said. Not the head of it. A seat. We want to be part of this accord as equals, contributing what we have found, sharing both the risks and the opportunities. That is what we have always wanted. The only thing that has changed today is that now we have something genuinely worth sharing. The silence stretched. 10 seconds, 20, 30. I could feel every delegation in the room processing, calculating, weighing the proposal against their own interests and their own fears. Then HFY Val spoke, her voice steady and clear through the translation matrix. The Kethali Trade Confederation supports this proposal. Gorath Kell, the Dreth ambassador, whose massive hands had been clenched on the tabletop throughout the session, opened them slowly and placed his palms flat on the surface. The Dreth Industrial Combine supports this proposal. One by one, voices added themselves. The Owelani, Ambassador Peleth, his skin a calm, steady blue. The Varathi, speaking through their eldest delegate in a voice that sounded like wind through a canyon. And then Morath, breaking centuries of Eurytine silence with a single word that fell into the room like a stone dropped into still water. Support. Quellardine looked around the table, and I watched him perform the same calculation I had seen him make before: honesty or evasion, resistance or adaptation. But the math had changed. The Rashathi were isolated. The Torvan, reading the room with the survival instincts that had kept their species alive through millennia of political maneuvering, had gone quiet. The Selathi were already running the numbers on trade access through a precursor transit network, and had no intention of being excluded from whatever came next. The declaration of hostile censure, Quellardine said, each word measured and placed with the precision of a man laying down weapons he had hoped to use, is rescinded. The vote was unanimous. Even the Rashathi voted in favor, because they understood at last that fighting a species with access to an uncheckable transit network was a war they could not win, and being excluded from the commission that governed those gates was a strategic loss they could not survive. Humanity was granted full membership in the Galactic Accord. The Vanta Oversight Commission was established by charter before the session ended, with representatives from 8 founding species and a governance structure that distributed authority so carefully that no single species could dominate. I was offered the position of first human representative to the commission. I accepted. The conference room emptied slowly. Delegates filed out in small groups, speaking quietly among themselves, the poisonous tension of the previous days dissolving not into trust, but into something that might, with time and patience, grow into it. HFY Val caught my eye as she passed, and gave me a nod that carried 7 years of carefully built alliance in its slight inclination. Gorath Kell paused beside my chair and said nothing, but placed one of his massive hands on the table near mine for a moment, which in Dreth culture was an expression of respect between equals. Morath was the last to approach. The ancient ambassador waited until the room was nearly empty, before stepping close enough to speak without being overheard. You changed your position, Morath said. Not a question. You changed my understanding. The Serenthi were wise, Nathan Cole. Wise enough to build civilizations. Wise enough to discover the network. Wise enough to unlock every door this galaxy had to offer. But they were not wise enough to stay. They were not wise enough to look at all those open doors and choose to remain in the room they already had. I hope your species is different. So do I said, and I meant it with everything I had. Morath left, and I sat alone at the table for a while, running my fingers across the smooth composite surface, feeling the slight warmth where 12 species had rested their hands and claws and appendages during the most consequential negotiation any of them had ever participated in. Then I stood up and walked out. I did not go to the commission offices. I did not go to the diplomatic wing to begin the work of implementation. I did not open a channel to the conductor, or call Sethri, or send a report to Earth. Instead, I walked through the corridors of Apex Meridian alone, retracing the path I had walked hundreds of times over 11 years, until I reached the grand conclave chamber. It was empty. The lights were set to standby mode, a dim ambient glow that left most of the amphitheater in shadow. The bioluminescent ceiling was dark, dormant, waiting for the next session to give it a mood to display. The tiered platforms rose into the dimness, like the empty seats of an arena after the crowd has gone home. My footsteps echoed as I walked down the central aisle, descending tier by tier, past the seats of 43 species, past the podium where Quellardine had delivered an indictment that he thought would end us, past the platforms where the red lights had climbed and the ceiling had turned crimson, until I reached the lowest level. The courtesy chair was where it had always been, small, unremarkable, tucked into the curve of the amphitheater's base like an afterthought, a footnote at the bottom of a document that nobody reads. I lowered myself into it one last time and felt the familiar contour of the cushion, the shape that 11 years of sitting had pressed into the material, like a fossil pressed into stone. I ran my hand along the armrest. The burn mark was still there, the small, dark scar from my cigarette, pressed into the polished surface 3 days ago, when 31 species had voted to go to war with mine. I traced the edge of it with my fingertip, and felt every year, every meeting, every ignored request, every quiet intelligence report, every carefully cultivated relationship that had led me from that moment to this one. I pulled out my last cigarette, the very last one from the vacuum case I had carried from Earth 11 years ago. The case was empty now, and I held it for a moment before slipping it back into my pocket. Then I put the cigarette between my lips, struck a match against the armrest, right beside the original burn mark, and lit it. The match flame was small and warm in the darkness of the empty chamber, and the first curl of smoke rose slowly toward the dormant ceiling, twisting in the still air like a question mark. I smoked it slowly. There was nothing to rush toward now, no clock counting down, no strategic calculation to run, no probability model to update, no intelligence to gather, no leverage to build, no back channel to maintain, just a man in a chair in a quiet room, with a cigarette and the kind of silence that comes only after something enormous has finished happening. I thought about Morath's warning, about the Serenthi, that brilliant and restless species who had found the network and used it and mastered it, and who had eventually walked through their own doors and vanished into a silence that had lasted longer than most civilizations exist. I wondered what they had found on the other side, whether it had been worth leaving everything behind for, whether they had looked back, even once, at the galaxy they were abandoning. I thought about whether humanity would follow the same path, whether we were built differently enough, or scarred enough by our own history, or wise enough in our own particular and imperfect way to hold on to the things that keep a species rooted: family, community, the stubborn, irrational attachment to a specific patch of ground under a specific sun, the capacity to look at an infinite number of open doors and choose to stay in the room where the people you love are sitting. I thought about the conductor, whoever they were, and the years of quiet, patient, invisible work that had led to this moment. I thought about Sethri Val and her 7 years of trust, about Gorath Kell reading that tariff file in his metal-scented conference room, his jaw grinding with anger that I had given him permission to feel, about Peleth standing in his pool, watching his skin change color as he absorbed the truth about who had been stealing his water, about Quellardine standing in my holding suite, asking me why I was not afraid, and leaving with a question he had not had when he arrived. I thought about the courtesy chair, this small, uncomfortable, deliberately humiliating piece of furniture that I had occupied for more than a decade. Every day, sitting beneath 43 species who looked down at me and saw something too small and too young and too temporary to take seriously. And every one of those days had been worth it. Because every one of those days had been building, quietly, invisibly, toward a moment when the man in the lowest chair in the room would stand up and the entire galaxy would feel the ground shift. The cigarette burned down to the filter. I pressed it into the armrest, exactly on top of the original burn mark, deepening the scar. 2 marks in the same place. The first one made in defiance, the second one made in something closer to gratitude. This chair had been my post, my cover, my hiding place, and my stage. It had made me invisible, and invisibility had made everything else possible. I stood up, straightened my coat, brushed the ash from my fingers, and I looked up at the darkened ceiling one final time, at the dormant bioluminescent surface that would glow again tomorrow, when the chamber filled with species who would now have to look across at humanity instead of down at us. They gave us a courtesy chair and expected us to be grateful. We turned it into a throne. The question now is whether we are wise enough not to sit in it forever. I walked out of the chamber, and I did not look back.